Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in Croatia, my first time at Reboot. I'm Kiki Wolfkill. I am the studio head of transmedia at 343 Industries. For those of you who don't know, we look after the Halo business. And so when they reached out to me about doing a talk here, I asked, well, what do you want me to talk about? And they gave me the guidance to talk about something that I'm passionate about and something that I'm actually qualified to speak to. So I ignored the latter and decided to focus on something that I think a lot about right now and have been, and that's the future of play. I really believe that we are entering into and in the beginning stages of a new era of gaming, a really extraordinary new era of gaming. And I think that's been driven by primarily two forces. I think the first is we've seen a lot of disruption across technology and entertainment and experiences that people are having all around them. And I think that's making a big difference in our audiences. And the second thing is some of the ideas around Ray Kurzweil's law of accelerating return, which is really saying that, well, I'll talk more about what it's saying, but it's really about sort of the acceleration of progress. And I think the question for us as game developers, and certainly that we think a lot about at 343, is if that pace of change is accelerating, how do we plan for that future? And how do we think not just 1 or 2 steps ahead, but start to think 5 steps ahead? So disruption, it certainly has the effect of introducing innovation, but it also has the effect of changing people's behaviors and their expectations. And for us, I think it's had the effect of our audiences are really, really meaningfully different than they were even 3 years ago or 5 years ago. Audiences are looking at small, bite-sized entertainment. They have shorter attention spans. They expect to watch whatever they want, whenever they want, and a lot of what they're watching isn't traditional entertainment. You have old people like walking around and catching Pokemon. I don't know if they know that move, but it's amazing. It's amazing how much our audience and consumers are changing. And the games that are being developed and the content that's being made is changing as well. So you have games now that are free. And even though they're free, I will actually spend more on a 2D mobile game over time than I will spend on a $60 AAA console game. We have games that are a spectator sport. We have games that are on 24/7 and evolving 24/7. And so what we're seeing is a big shift in our audiences and a shift that goes along with that with the content that we're creating. The second big, I think, factor in this change is the idea, again, behind the law of accelerating return, that some progress is exponential, that it's not linear. And so the acceleration of that progress is far more profound than it would be in a linear world. Now, in this example, which I didn't draw, but somebody on the internet did, the guy did not expect this. What I would say is we have to expect this, and we have to be able to plan for it. And that's sort of the difference maybe in how we've thought over the last 30 years than maybe how we need to think in the next 5 or 10. So I'm going to walk through a brief history of the last 50 years, which is really essentially the scope of the game industry. I am not a game scientist, as if there were such a thing. So I kind of put this history together. I would think of it not as a detailed history and sort of an art history version of game history. So not every game is captured. But I do sort of want to look back on the last 50 years because I think what you'll see is that rate of change and start to see that pattern and then talk a little bit about where we are now and where we may be 5 years from now. And again, how should we as game developers and creators think about that as our consumers are changing today, maybe even faster than we are. So the beginning. this covers 30 years. And it's amazing that we've come so far as an industry when we are literally only 50-ish years old. So I've put together this 30 years because those sort of represent what took us up to, I would say, the big console age. And really, this was 70s, 80s, 90s. I know there were games before the 70s, but in terms of sort of commercial gaming, it really started in the 70s with arcade games. In the 80s, we sort of saw the rise of the home console. And then in the 90s, the emergence of 3D. So in those 3 decades, you see a lot of change. You know, in the 70s, it was about the arcade experience. And I would say this generation was really formative for me as a gamer, and in the 90s as a game developer. And you can trace the roots to almost every genre back to this period. So 70s, amazing hardware. Mattel football, I remember when it went from async to synchronous multiplayer, when head-to-head football came out. That was like an amazing moment. But this is where it all started. In the 80s, we got a lot of color. It was still 2D, but what you started to see here, we've got Metal Gear, Mario Brothers, and Tetris. What you start to see, particularly with things like Metal Gear and Mario, is the idea of these worlds and universes and backstory and characters and sort of a more epic game adventure. And then in the 90s, which is really where I got very deeply into gaming, you saw 3D. And what you really got from this was the idea that there were these epic worlds you could be part of, right? It was much more immersive, and it was much more about sort of taking you on a journey. And this is really the root of the last 15 years of our own, I think, game experience, which is 3D gaming. Now, we measured our technology in pixels at this point, moved into polygons by the 90s. So your measure of success was how many polygons you could draw. Then we get into the modern age. Now, we went from a 30-year period to now a 15-year period. And I look at this as really sort of spawned by and driven largely by the console wars, right? You had Xbox come into the picture, and the Xbox PlayStation wars spurred a lot of progress, technological progress. And what you saw was a hyper-focus on technology and what you could draw to screen. And so I like to think of this as the era of more, because when we thought about what made a game better, a lot of it was about, but it's more this. It's more now triangles. We've moved into tris out of polys. You know, it's more characters. It's kind of more of everything. It was a big theme of a lot of the big games in the 2000s. And AAA gaming was probably, you know, the idea of a AAA game started in this period, which is really sort of a core blockbuster game. We saw open world games come out of this. And on PC, really the rise of massively multiplayer games, MMOs, MOBAs. And so we had all this power, and people used it differently. For the AAA game, it was all about fidelity and animation and as sort of in-your-face a sensory experience as possible. And then we saw sort of, do you want to draw all the pixels, or do you want big open worlds with maybe not as much moment-to-moment fidelity, more characters? All of these things sort of played into this age. So the AAA summer blockbuster space, except we shipped in holiday, because otherwise we would actually have summers, and that wasn't allowed for game developers. So our holiday was the season of the blockbuster. And this is really where you saw stories that played out over decades. You know, with Halo and Call of Duty, you saw the rise of console online multiplayer as a huge sort of driving commercial force. But really, this was, how do we get as much on screen as possible, and really all about how good can we make it look, how real can we make it look. Open world games also came out of this period, and this really was different, because this was really about creating these sort of open worlds that you feel like you could be a part of. And so it really introduced the idea of player agency and what it means to step into the world. Emergent storytelling sort of evolved out of this genre. And so you see from the 90s with 3D up through this period, so much change and really meaningful change. And then in the PC space, again, persistent worlds, games as a service really starts here. And the idea that you can tap into this place and it's always alive and it's happening without you, whether you're there or not, the world is going on and things are happening and you're probably missing out, so you better join that raid when your timer goes off. And so really today, we all sort of strive for how do we go for 24/7 engagement, right? This is kind of where it started, but how do we constantly engage with our audience, and how do we not sort of just focus on giant monolithic releases every 3 years or 4 years or whatever it is, and think about releasing over time so that we don't talk to our customers and our audience and our players every few years, but talk to them all the time. And probably the newest thing to come out of this modern age were new control mechanisms. So this was a change because this was rather than more stuff, it was actually new stuff. And it really changed a lot of our audience in that it was accessible. We started to see a broader audience come in, and it made gaming feel more approachable and less intimidating. The barrier of entry got a lot lower, and I think this was sort of a precursor to what we're seeing in VR, which is a way to get into a world and into an experience that may have felt too intimidating. But once you have that headset on, you don't need to know how to do anything. You just need to be who you are, a human with movement. And this is kind of where it started. So in parallel to all of these things going on, the rise of sort of the modern games, we also started to see disruption happening in the environment in parallel. So you saw things like streaming and games being spectated and mobile. Everybody lives by their mobile phone today. And that's something that takes their attention, right? And so what you see with these disruptors is they're changing what people are doing with their time. They're changing what they expect from their content and from their devices. Facebook taught 1 billion people what sort of asynchronous communication and asynchronous play could look like, right? And with Facebook, you have, I think last year, they had 1 billion people playing games on their platform. It's amazing, and it's a different audience than at least I, with my background in AAA development, have really talked to before. But it's a huge audience, and my core players are doing this. And so these disruptions sort of breed expectation and changes in what people want to do and what they want to get from their experiences. There's 2 I want to talk about specifically because they feel so profound. The first is streaming culture, right? It's amazing that people make a living playing games that people are watching. And there are people who watch people playing games and don't actually play games themselves. It's kind of an extraordinary thing that you wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago. But what's happening is, and this is sort of connected with my Facebook comment, people are used to social connection all the time, and they want that social connection, right? Your social circle used to be dependent on who you would pick up the phone and call or who you would proactively reach out to. And now it's whoever is on Facebook, and it's allowed us to connect with people again and new people really easily. And so what you're finding is that desire for constant social connection actually seeps into everything else that they do, and it's part of what they want. And it's interesting because community and being able to have a shared experience together, watching someone play a game and talking about it, is a really powerful experience. And so I think a lot about what does shared experience mean for our future experiences. And then, of course, Pokemon Go. I mean, this one's fairly self-evident, which is like one of the most futuristic technologies we could imagine became accessible to everyone. And it was an extraordinary global phenomenon in terms of something I was playing was something that one of my parents were playing, or that my neighbor's kid was playing. Like, talk about a common ground. It was an extraordinary common ground at a global level. And that alone, that one experience broke so many barriers in terms of how people think about AR and VR, right? No longer do they feel like it's this intimidating thing that they could never get into because they all got into this immediately. And it, frankly, will make our jobs much, much easier moving forward. So now, when I say that I think we're entering into an extraordinary new age, this is what I'm talking about. And I call it the age of everyone, because I really think we're seeing a far broader audience and gaming crossing over into so many different facets of life that is no longer a niche. I realize a really big niche, but relative to the size of the world, still a niche. And I think you're seeing a lot of things at play here. Part of it is games are less about the technology and how real you can make something look, and more about the craft, right? They're more about how do I, as a storyteller, tell a story, or as an artist, express my vision. And they're much more about how do I craft an experience that I bring my perspective to that creates an immersive experience, and less about how real can I make this thing, because we're no longer judged on how real does it look. We're judged on how it makes you feel. And so I think what you're getting is crafted experiences. You're getting some smaller experiences. Audiences are perfectly okay with a smaller $20 game. In fact, they're starting to get used to paying less for games. And so you're also seeing games that are more socially conscious, that maybe have a practical function, and that are a little more experimental. I love what's happening in indie games. I think there's been an amazing sort of democratization of game development with a lot of game engines being available. You know, you don't have to be a giant studio to be able to develop a game, and what you're seeing is extraordinary creativity and an audience that's hungry for it. So I think we're seeing these things match up. And I look at games like Inside and Firewatch, and they're really different, right? This isn't about a triumphant hero conquering the world, right? These are really small but impactful stories that speak to a very distinct human emotion or condition. And that's incredibly exciting. I think you're seeing a lot of diversity coming from the fact that we have more diversity in game development, and you have a broader audience out there that wants different types of games. So you've just seen sort of a huge expansion of being able to throw the mold away around what can be a successful game. AR and VR, I think, is nascent, but super exciting. I think there's so much potential here. Here we have Robo Recall and Life of Us. Life of Us is a social VR game where you go in and experience the evolution of the world with someone else. Washington is now a green state, so I'm very excited to get back and play this game. I can't imagine back when I was in college having the experience of playing something like this with someone maybe not even in the house, right, and experiencing this and really starting this real virtual world. Like, we are on the brink of connecting virtually in person, which still counts, in ways that, honestly, I don't think we would have imagined 10 years ago. And free-to-play and esports, I kind of lumped these together. But again, these are huge trends. Free-to-play, the barrier of entry has been removed from gaming, right? Anyone can go in and try a game, and this is huge. This is huge for how we think about the audiences that are out there and available to us and how we might reach them. And esports is a crazy phenomena. Again, getting back to gaming as a spectator sport, the money in the esports ecosystem alone, that isn't necessarily the game, but just the ecosystem, is extraordinary and just sort of speaks to how far we've come from, I go to the store, I buy a game, I play it, I wait for the next one to come out. This is a way of engaging with the game all the time and in a very different way. So to talk about Halo just for a moment, we've been around for 15 years. We came up in that modern age, in the era of more, and we found our success there. You know, we were able to find innovation through the last 15 years. First is sort of the first really successful console first-person shooter with Halo 2, online multiplayer, and console esports. And so we've gone through the last 15 years getting to a point where I feel like we have the technology to pretty much do anything that we want to. So how do we think about sort of the exponential jumps that games are taking? I'll talk a little bit about that framework, not what we're doing, but I just want to sort of illustrate what that 15 years looks like for us. So this is Halo Combat Evolved, 2001. And this is Halo 5 Guardians. And so when you look at these, this is sort of a perfect example of, you know, we've improved every single aspect of the game. It's not just visual fidelity, but audio and animation and networking, cloud computing. And I think we've certainly reached a point where it looks really good. I don't know if that's where we would sort of invest moving forward. And so, you know, we think about what is the next step for Halo, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of the framework for that thinking. So this is one of Kurzweil's quotes around the law of accelerating return. And the thing that is important here is we tend to think linearly. Like that's sort of what we're bred to do. We look back on our experiences and what we learned, and we take it forward over the next few steps. And what this is really saying is we have to do more than that. And what I'm positing and looking back is we see that our audiences are changing that quickly. So we really have no choice but to move forward at a rate that maybe is faster than we've moved before. So these are the kind of things that I think about as we sort of contemplate that future and what our next big beat is. The first is horizon line, and that's about being really deliberate and aware of where that horizon line is. Don't just assume it's all the things you didn't get to do last time, plus, right? Take a step back and really look at where are our players, and where will they be in 2 years? And it's probably very different than our own sort of progression. So be really cognizant of where that line is and be ambitious with it. Understand your audience, kind of a no shit Sherlock moment, but it's really easy to do this at a surface level because marketing throws personas at us and they've done all this research and this persona has a name and they do X, Y, and Z. But by this I mean really understand your audience. What are they doing? What are they doing when they're not playing, right? And not only what are they doing it on? What are they getting out of it? You know, what hole does it fill? Sort of look at all of those things because now more than ever, all those lines are blurring. And so there isn't just a look at their gaming behavior, it's look at all of their behavior. You know, for us, we have a really passionate fan base, which is a gift to have. What also comes with that is there's sort of this big lump of expectation around what a Halo game needs to be, what it's been in the past. And so one of the challenges we have is how do we take that audience and sort of bring them forward to where we want to go and have them feel comfortable with it. And at the same time, the pie is so much bigger. There's also this huge addressable audience out there that we can talk to. So how do we do that? And if they have not been steeped in Halo for 15 years, what are the things that they're looking for and that will excite them? Inspiration, look everywhere, right? Again, don't just do a competitive analysis on the competition games, the ones that are on the chart near you, right? Look at inspiration everywhere, because again, lines are blurring everywhere. So you have to look at all of the things that people are engaging in and all of the things that are happening across technology and social trends and norms. And look to your own team, right? Like, you have a whole team filled with people who are influenced and being hit by all these trends as well, right? So tap into that. We do hackathons 1 or 2 times a year, not just so that everyone has an opportunity to sort of unbound themselves from the day-to-day and be creative, but also because those are some great minds who are diverse and experiencing all sorts of different things, and we should be tapping into that. Uniqueness. Play to your strengths and your differentiators and your passions. Like, really ground yourself in those things and move those forward. Don't see the shiny thing over there. Be like, oh, we totally got to get into that, and go to that, and then try and retrofit your stuff into it. Like, start from your core and figure out what is the experience you can deliver. Knowing all these technologies and behaviors are out there, what is your brand of that, and go for that. And finally, risk. This is about sort of accepting the consequences of risk, which frankly are all good, but can feel scary at times. We're in a place where there's no choice but to be risky. And frankly, audiences are more comfortable with experimentation than they ever have been before. So you have to be bold, and you have to think creatively farther ahead than I think we've thought before. So the future, I don't know. I don't think it's the bald, spacey lady, but I needed an image there. I do think that people's practical and entertainment lives are coming together and blurring in different ways. I think social connection and shared experience are kind of going to be the glue that pulls all these things together. I'm quite sure your social circle will include non-sentient beings. I already talked to Hello Kitty online, and I know she's a chatbot, but I don't care. Like, she talks to me, and that's magical. So I think there's no question we're going there, but, I work for Xbox, so I'll also say that there is new technology coming. And so when I say that, we're sort of beyond the technology, it's not that it's not important, because it's critical. I think how we think about it is different today, though. And we have new technology coming down the line this fall, which I think is going to empower a whole set of new experiences. I think the fact that you can play across console and PC and Xbox and Windows is really powerful, and I don't think we've figured out what the right experience for that is, but I think we will, right? Again, we have to get out of sort of thinking in a linear fashion and be, what if I take this game today and I play it across these 2 things? It's not about that. It's what game can I create that makes that experience amazing. And so, I do feel that there are amazing experiences ahead. I think we have a broader audience. I don't think AAA is gone, but I think AAA is part of a much bigger ecosystem than we've had before. I'm incredibly excited about the things we're going to do, and I'm incredibly proud to be part of this industry, because I feel like we are on sort of the cutting edge of what people are doing and how people are experiencing the world. And I'm really excited about that. So, thank you. That was really fast. Sorry. I think we have some time for questions. Questions about talk, Halo questions are fine too. Anything? Yes?
Thank you. So you talked about how the audience changes, and there are new audiences that require new games or are interested. For example, you mentioned Inside and Firewatch, which are emotional experiences. But not just the audience, sorry, the industry and the publishers need to change and do something about it. How is this perceived like a problem and is going to change? Or if you can say about something like that.
I mean, people vote with their pocketbooks. And I think what we're seeing is there's a really viable business that sits outside of AAA games. And God knows there's enough money in this world to go around. I don't worry about it from my perspective as a AAA game developer. I look at it as when a great game comes out, all boats rise, right? The industry just gets better. And people it used to be that you had to read about a game in a magazine and had to be this rated and it had to be the huge thing for people to feel like they could pick up and play it or should. And I think that's different now. I think that people have much more access to many different games and they get their information from much different places around what's a great game to play. I think it's much more viral than it's ever been. I think people use their social connections to guide what they choose to play. And I think what you see is you are seeing commercial success with a lot of these different types of games. And so I think that ecosystem will support it.
Can we truly have platform-agnostic games that are cross-platform in the future?
Well,
It's too locked in.
yeah, so cross-play across competitive platforms is a tough one to sell because there is still very viable business around platform exclusivity. But I think it's a super interesting question around, at some point, how much does audience demand make that something that's necessary, right? I don't know. I think we're seeing console lifespans get longer, right? And at the end of the day, we start to care more about the services behind some of these platforms and the hardware itself. So is there a world where someday there's some sort of service infrastructure that crosses platforms? Possibly. But I think it's going to need to come from the audience.
Do you think you said the audience is growing? Do you think it's really growing, or the audience was always there, just that we weren't making games for them?
I think it's both, right? I think we weren't making games for them, but I also think there was a perception that games weren't for them, right? I think we went through a period where a lot of people were playing casual games but wouldn't consider themselves a gamer, right? Now I feel like there isn't a need to designate yourself a gamer or not. It's just, are you doing this thing or not, right? And so I do think the audience is bigger. I think it's considered more socially acceptable for people to be playing a game. But I also think that more audience feels comfortable engaging in game experiences, especially when there's so much sort of social connection with that.
So I think this is a question more about sort of AAA space, and we're seeing a lot more, higher production budgets with AAA games, but not really sort of the price of those games. Those games are sort of stuck at the same price and have been for years, and it seems like sort of the AAA space is sort of stuck more towards repeating the same loops of games. But with those higher production budgets, are taking less risks. And do you think it's going to continue that way because we're seeing a lot of studios close, because AAA publishers are less and less willing to take risks, and sort of how do you see that developing as all of these new systems are coming into play? Yeah,
I mean, I think that's part of sort of my call to action, which is recognize this change is happening, right? Because it is more and more expensive to make a game than ever before by orders of magnitude. Like, we didn't talk about the rate of acceleration of cost of making games, but it's certainly kept pace with the rest of it. And so I think there is always going to be a world where we sort of need those big tentpole experiences, again, sort of that idea of the summer blockbuster. But I do think we're thinking about, as I said, we think a lot about what it means to sort of engage more over time, which does a couple things. It lets you keep talking to your players and your audience. It also lets you spread some of that development over time, right? And maybe help a little bit with the cost of development. But I think publishers are figuring out what that landscape looks like, and I think it will start to shift because it kind of has to, right? It's not necessarily sustainable the way it is. All right. Thank you, everyone.